Good evening, everyone, and thank you. You know, we're very prompt because we stream. Hi. Good evening. So thank you so much. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. We appreciate everybody joining us tonight, both those who are with us in person in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum, as well as to all of our virtual viewers. It's a great pleasure of mine to introduce tonight's program. Elise Perry England, Assistant Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is joining us. And Elise and I know each other from back in the Met, and she joined the American Wing at the Met in June of 2015 and oversees the 17th to early 19th century furniture collections. Previously, she worked at the Wadsworth Atheneum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and Historic New England. She received her master's from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture, a BA in Art History from the University of Vermont, as an alumna of the Addingham Study Program. She has organized exhibitions on topics such as decorative arts from Connecticut, poetry and art, and the Civil War, and has published scholarship on Japan furniture, Connecticut's Federal-era cabinet makers, and folk art. At the Met, she curated Simple Gifts, Shaker at the Met, 2016 to 2017, and co-curated Chippendale's Director, The Designs and Legacy of a Furniture Maker in 2018 to 2019. Tonight's talk, entitled The Matriarchs Mobilia, A Female View of Historic American Furniture, focuses on the influential role women played in the operations of furniture workshops and domestic life in the 1700s and 1800s. Please join me in welcoming Elise.
Hello, all. I'm really not used to all this fanfare, so forgive me. And this is actually water, not wine. Time to go hoarse. So I appreciate all of you coming out to hear me tonight because I will, as you'll hear, I'm working through a number of different ideas, especially as we approach our 100th anniversary in the American Wing in 2024. So congratulations on such an incredible job of installing new galleries, as well as having this wonderful 150th anniversary of the Concord Free Libraries collection as well. And thank you to Lisa, to Allison, and of course to David. All of what I know about Concord comes from you, so I appreciate you sharing the knowledge. And as many of you may know, I'm not a stranger to Concord. That actually, my husband grew up in Canantum, and so we are very familiar with walking up and down the Sudbury looking for turtles, stuffing ourselves at Farrell Farms, and in addition to that, hiding out on rainy days at the Concord Free Library. So we are certainly very familiar with this area. And it's just an incredible place because of the rich history and culture that has been here for generations and generations. And I'm not just reminded of Concord in my personal life at home, but every day I walk past this woman who also was a temporary visitor in Concord, but also appreciated it, and was truly witness to one of the greatest events in this town's history in 1775, having watched very close to the North Bridge the events of the first shot heard around the world. So it's wonderful to have that reminder and both ends, both personally and also in this professional setting. And to show you today are some of the connections between our collections. Thank you very much. Connections between the collections, and especially because if you haven't visited me yet, I visited you, so now it's your job to come to me. This is where I work. This is the facade of the American Wing. Again, a lot of the collecting history, David and I went over this today, that some of the elements that were coming into your collection were coming in to our collection at the same time. So those really foundational collections and especially from the sources of the families that had held on to these works for so many years. And in addition to that, what you may remember from the old museum was the period rooms. Well, there was a real advent for that, of course, that the Met had also experienced, and we are very much known for our 17 historic period rooms, and that contextualization of these decorative arts and even archaeological material really comes alive in some of these stage sets from the past. So it's very interesting, but we do have a lot in common, even though we're in two different places. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, what I've been doing recently was really looking at the American wing, and in preparation for this 100th anniversary we're about to experience, looking at the ways that our collection has been presented. So here I show you over on the right-hand side, this is an image of the American wing when it was a freestanding wing outside of the Metropolitan Museum of Art when it was first built in 1924. And one of the first installations of early decorative arts in the Metropolitan Museum in 1909 over here on the right-hand side. And it shows essentially, yes, we've come a long way. Our galleries do not look like this at the present. They've progressed some. But here's a screenshot of our web catalog for a particular object I'll show you a little bit later on. It shows that we've really highlighted a pretty narrow storyline, which really focuses on the head of the furniture workshops and, making attributions to them, but not thinking about a lot of the other people that were instrumental in terms of the craftsmanship or the production, or in general, the support network that was involved in creating these pieces. So what I want everybody to think about today is there's a lot of different directions we can go in terms of our interpretation and focusing on different groups. But for the brevity of the talk tonight, I'm focusing solely on women and thinking about how women are really involved in furniture. And there's essentially a myth that goes along with furniture that women were not able to produce it because they were not as strong or they weren't guild trained. But ultimately, women are part of the fabric of furniture, whether it is in operational support, whether it's patronage, or whether it's also in terms of shaping the types of forms and the interest in those forms or the use of those forms. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples where I'm rethinking that in terms of our collections. And what everybody will walk away from today is the thought that who is the woman that helped to shape the existence of this furnishing? So every time you see a piece of furniture, you're not going to say, who is that made by? You're going to say, who was the woman involved in that piece? So this is more a personal anecdote, and I had to put this in here. It's not from Massachusetts at all. This is a suite of furniture that was made for the Cadwallader family of Philadelphia. So John and Elizabeth Cadwallader. It is attributed to the workshop of Benjamin Randolph, a very large operation. But every time I walked by this pinnacle of the Met's collection, everybody loves this suite of furniture. Probably some of the greatest furniture that exists in our collection. It really bugged me because all it said was Benjamin Randolph. And I couldn't help myself to think of the larger story about this. And luckily, I know a fair amount about these pieces. But these were pieces, so on the left-hand side, you have a chair. It's one of a suite. So there are many other examples in other museum collections, like the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And on the right-hand side, a pole screen, a fire screen, that was also made by the Randolph shop, and again, for the Cadwallader family. There's a couple of them out there, Philadelphia Museum and other places. And these are two incredible pieces. When you look at them, there is just carving dripping off of these pieces. It's the apex of Rococo design at the time. They're literally out of design books from England, and they are just the best of the type that you could possibly get. So while we attribute this to Randolph's workshop, you can really think about two other women who really deserve some credit in all of this, that in addition to Randolph and all of his male workers, both There were immigrant craftsmen who worked on the chair. We believe that there was a man named Hercules Courtenay who had worked in London before he came to work in Philadelphia. And with the fire screen, there was another duo, well-known duo, Nicholas Bernard and Martin Jugues, both immigrant craftsmen that came to, again, produce some of this incredible Floriate, really high relief type of carving, very sought after in the period. But these are things that, again, neglect some of that female element in terms of how are women involved in the creation of this suite. So Benjamin Randolph had Quaker roots, but he became an active member in the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia when he married a woman named Anna Bromwich in 1762. A number of his major commissions came through these church connections. And in addition to that, just a year after their marriage, Anna inherited a large sum of money from her father's estate. And almost immediately after, Randolph would put this capital to work and purchase his own workshop on Chestnut Street, which was also not too far from where the Cadwalladers lived, and also gave him sort of that mystique of being on the very chic street. He also invests in a large amount of lumber, which obviously was integral to producing furniture like this. And it also gave him the ability to buy equipment like specialized tools and also pay top dollar for the best carvers coming right out of these London guilds. So this capital really was put to work and obviously was largely something that was transformative for him in his workshop and was due partly to his wife, Anna. Likewise, the patron capital to acquire this furniture and buy this was due to Mrs. Cadwallader, so Elizabeth Cadwallader. She was the heiress to a fortune that came from her father. So her father, Edward, was one of the largest landowners in Maryland at the time. It was estimated that he had over 3,700 acres of plantation land in Maryland. He had numerous numbers of enslaved people. He had livestock. He also gave her directly silver, and her total estate that she inherited from her father was estimated to be roughly about 11,000 pounds at the time, so an extraordinary amount of money. So it's very interesting to consider a couple of things in all of this, that there's two different women, both on the patron side and operations, that contributed something in order to produce work at this level. But another factor is also in terms of how we attribute things to craftsmen, and especially the male head of craft, of the craft workshop. Likely when Randolph was taking on commissions of this scale, he's moving away from the actual day-to-day bench work of actually fabricating works. He's handing it off to these expert people who have a different level of skill than he personally does. And he's managing things more. He's got bigger things going on. He's got to do supply orders. He's got to tell these people what to do. But still, we attribute these things to a person of his type. And so the attribution is really ascribed to his leadership and the financial capital that he's got in these particular operations. So if that's the case, then why are we not putting Anna Bromwich's name on this attribution as well? And in addition to that, Anna Bromwich would have been part of the larger operations of essentially keeping the workshop in motion, not necessarily from digging in and doing some of the carving or construction, but she would have absolutely been a part of the day-to-day operations in terms of making sure that both Benjamin Randolph and many of his workers, so if he had apprentices or journeymen and people even living with them at the time, they would have been cared for. So feeding, clothing, housing people would have absolutely been something that would have touched Anna Bromwich Randolph's lives. So there's definitely a larger consideration for women that we certainly need to start thinking about in a more serious way. And certainly it's something I'm attempting to do, especially as we approach our 100th anniversary and I've got some labels to write. So one of the issues I have with this is that it's very hard to document women in the woodworking trades. So, we would have done this already. David and all sorts of other scholars before me would have absolutely written down all the names of women working in the woodworking trades if a lot of records existed, but they don't. So one of the challenges is that we have to go on what does exist And I always love this print. So it's kind of great because it has two different meanings to it. But it's a wonderful Dutch copper engraving from about 1615. And it's this incredible scene of, this master craftsman and his wife slaving away, sawing, this large log. And it certainly has two different meanings that, it's literally the moment where you're trying to get along with your husband in a professional setting and it doesn't always work out, but it's sort of an allegory to that in terms of marital relations. And then in addition to that too, it does say something about the period itself and how women truly were jumping in to supplement operations and assist with whatever task needed. So maybe it is in the behind the scenes of the household work, but it also can be in these circumstances where they're very close to the operations within a woodworking shop. And just to give you a sense that it's not unheard of for women to be working in the woodworking trades. From the 1600s to the 1800s, there are records in English guilds of women working in the turning trade. So a little bit different from joinery, in that this is, again, you're using a lathe and you're kind of doing these very specific types of profiles. These are the types of things, turned elements could be on chairs, on tables, they could be banisters. So a different type of work in some respects to some of the heavier duty types of joinery and some of the craft work that you see, at least in cabinet making. But what we do know is that in English records, in the turning trade, there were roughly 7,300 turners, and 179 of which were led by a female, and even there are records of about 21 apprentices to young women. So again, in that apprentice age between the ages of 14 to 21. So that's an extraordinary thing that I was, previously not very aware of, and this is the type of thing that I think most people don't necessarily assume. In addition to that, there's also the record keeping that shows that women are also involved in other trades, such as blacksmithing, silversmithing. So one would assume that there is much more participation, even though there aren't documents. And even in those types of trades where it is a very laborious, physically, very difficult type of trade. So women, if they can do blacksmithing, they can do this. And we all know that now anyway, so. So there's other great records too that we know women are involved in the operations in many other ways from some of the surviving records, but I also like to look at this print. This is again a European print, it's from a French printer, and it's the workshop of Jean Jadot, who is a carpenter, so again, not necessarily a joiner or cabinet maker, but someone who is actually working, again, in the woodworking trade. And what I love about this is that it gives you the scale of operations in the woodworking trade, that you have soup to nuts here. So what you have is over on the left-hand side, up in the top left, you can see that there's people sawing, again, milling those boards down into much more usable size. You can see that people are planing things down. You've got this guy who's planing the door plumb. Over on the right-hand side, someone is actually starting to do some more ornamental carving. And then down in the left-hand corner, down on her knees with the basket, there's a woman picking up a number of the shavings off of the floor. And you can see, she's sort of, it's almost that hierarchy where women are at the lowest level, but she's there. And that's the important part, is to show the presence, that it was hard to ignore, even for this person who is an observer making a print for a popular series. It's hard for him to ignore the fact that women are present in these workshops, and even at the scale of Jean Jadot, who was making large commissions for churches and even more aristocratic types of commissions. So it's really important to see that they are absolutely part of this food chain within these cabinet making and woodworking workshops. So in your collections, again, these are the parallels that I see, that when I think of what I'm working with and then I come here and I see some of these parallels, it's pretty striking to look at some of the same narratives, and obviously those places where I'm considering inserting a whole other layer of discussion. So something we have in common are these great examples of furniture from the Simons shop. So largely produced in Salem or the North Shore as family members kind of splintered off. But this was a shop that was established by a man named John Simons. He immigrated from Norfolkshire in 1636. He is heralded as the person who transplanted these East Anglian types of geometric forms and this type of woodworking tradition into the North Shore of Massachusetts. And it's this blending of both the familiar from the parent country in England with this fresher look, being revitalized and renewed in the New World. So people have just poured over his work for many generations. You'll see Simons pieces in all the major institutions. And he too carried on the tradition through his two sons, James and Samuel, and cultivated many other apprentices. There was a gentleman named John Pease who trained with them and then extended the practice as he moved into Connecticut and set up a shop there. So there's this great breadth of this practice of the Simons tradition, even in Connecticut, and even grandsons. So this is a multi-generational family business, one that was carrying on in this similar fashion for many, many years. So it's interesting to look at John Simons and his work, but to think about that moment of him and his transition, that as he's coming from Norfolk and coming to the American colonies, prior to migrating, he married a woman in 1624 named Ruth Fox. She was the girl from the next town over, and I imagine had a lot of similar religious and cultural connections with him. They had 6 children, one who died in infancy, but the other 5 at the ages of 3, 6, 8, 10, and 11 migrated on that boat with them for over 6 weeks to the New World. And I just want you to imagine the most horrific car ride you've ever had with your kids in the car, minus wheels, minus screens, minus snacks, you name it. The worst car ride ever. And then times 6 weeks. So nothing we ever have experienced now with all of the challenges we do could ever match that type of journey. In addition, their journey was treacherous, plagued with disease, theft, and exploitation, and also afforded no privacy whatsoever. So not even a candle to what we experience now. But the one comfort that Ruth may have had with all of these children traveling this distance may have been her sister Elizabeth. And she was, of course, the unmarried sister who accompanied them, as many unmarried women did in that time period. And the sad truth is that she was accompanying her to help, but also to be the spare should anything happen to her sister, which it did. That in 1635, Ruth had died, and Elizabeth married John Simons and stepped in for her sister. So Ruth's son James and Elizabeth's son, she would later have a boy named Samuel, these half-brothers and cousins, which is also something you kind of have to figure out. They're only 5 years apart, but they would carry on this shop tradition together. So it's interesting. So this is where I stop, and I have these very female moments with pieces like this. And I stop and look at that form of both the dower chest in your collection, and of course, in our collection, a chest of drawers, which would have held lots of linens and clothing and other personal items. I feel they take on a very different meaning when you think of that narrative of those two women. And these vessels that are intended to protect all of the valuable things that they bring into their marriage, so the linens, the clothing, needleworking and food preparation tools, personal assets that these young women would have had and needed to carry into their married life. And as they're migrating, these are things that are coming long distances and may have that last vestige of what they remember their parents as they leave them on the shores back in England. So something that had very nostalgic connections. And in addition, these are things too that may have been inherited by the next woman to step into their lives. So as Ruth passed, her assets are going into her sister's hands to carry on that life. And as Elizabeth is taking on this new life, she's not only mourning the death of her sister, but she's nursing her children, she's raising her own, she's tending to her new husband, she's also tending to apprentices, journeymen in the workshop, and she's fueling this busy household with sustenance, religious education, and even structure. So all of that geometric formation, all of what its form does, this takes on new meaning to me, just in that sense of thinking about those women who may have been part of its existence. So it's fun to think about these pieces because it's similar in so many other places too, and even pieces with period connections. So on the left is a piece from the Metz collection. We call it the Searle Dennis chest, according to attributions to two men. And on the right-hand side, you actually have a very small panel, which it's kind of fun because it's like archaeology. These are the small panels that would have been framed inside of one of these chests. So it's just a portion of what the full piece would have looked like, but has that very similar, the tree of life carving in it, as you can see up close with your panel. So these two men, Thomas Dennis and William Searle, are actually connected through a woman named Grace Cole Searle. And it's a very interesting story, again, with similarities to the Simons, in that William Searle was a joiner from Devon, England, and he married a woman named Grace Cole in 1659, and they both migrated here to Massachusetts in 1663. In 1667, Searle dies. We don't know if it's due to illness or age. And another joiner named Thomas Dennis moves to Ipswich, where Searle was working in 1668, but he moves from New Hampshire. It's not like he's already there. He moves from New Hampshire, which has always been a big question about what was the motivation. And a little bit later on in that year, he marries Searle's widow, Grace, and the shop carries on producing things in the same manner as it had before with William Searle. So it's very interesting to think about the agency of these women in the operations of these workshops. And did Grace Searle seek out another cabinet maker, or was her setting ideal to attract someone from that profession and industry to just jump right into what her husband had doing? So how much agency did she have that? And we surely know that Grace Cole Searle was certainly instrumental in keeping this shop going, that had she not married another cabinet maker, we would not see many of these out there. So it's very interesting because it comes down to this situation that legally, socially, and religiously, women in the 17th and 18th century were very much pressured to remarry should their husband pass, or they would be subject to accusations of witchcraft or prostitution. You pick, both bad. And especially those women with considerable assets or businesses from their prior husbands, like Grace Searle, she obviously would have absolutely been a target in her community in that respect. And there's a certain type of status that unmarried women were considered femme sole, and then married women were considered femme covert, which is covered woman. And that covert status, or coverture, stipulated that a woman who was married did not have a separate legal existence from her husband. She was like a dependent, like an underage child, or even considered property, like an enslaved person would. She could not earn money in her own name under the British system, and essentially she could not even sue or sign contracts, and her husband would have to get her permission in order to use some of the assets she might have come in with, but ultimately he didn't really have to, and it was up to her to sort of prove or go against him, and that could also have other consequences. So the property a woman had, the only case where she might have actually had some agency would have been her dower right to anything that came in, and if she was to carry that into her next remarried state, she may have had some rights over it, but ultimately not much. So while unfortunate to be a widow, they have a surprising level of agency for that time period. And I really like looking at these two prints because it sums up some of the elements of agency that women as widows may have had. And so here on the right-hand side, you have this wonderful Hogarth print of, a widow being wooed, and then on the left-hand side, a fantastic French print called The Coquettish Widow. And I'll get into both of those, which is kind of interesting. But I will just say it this way, that widows were hot stuff, that they often had property, livestock, they had useful equipment, household furniture, even children, which were laborers. Often wives were at the center of coordination of their household, so they knew all the other servants or people that were coming here and there. And in addition to that too, they may have understood some about their husband's businesses as well. So they may have known about creditors, or even just how certain laborers worked. They may have had existing relationships with other types of patrons or suppliers. So it's really interesting to see that they actually did have some power to wield, and obviously tremendous capital in that as well. So it's interesting too that in the left-hand side with the coquettish widow, there's an interesting, I'll translate it from French for you, but it more or less says that the widow expresses two moments of change, and one is the freedom to make new choice, and the other is of being changed, is the fear of being changed. So it's interesting that she obviously wants to figure out best path forward for herself, but what kind of person will allow her to do that? So it's interesting that there's a statistic that as many as half of the Anglo-American women in these early periods, 1600s up to the 1800s, found themselves widowed at some point. So it would have been a very common, sentiment and obviously experience for many of them. So one more of my favorite early texts is this book. It's called The English Tradesman, published in 1726 by Daniel Defoe, who was, produced a lot of very popular books at the time. And this book really addresses something that Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, a fantastic scholar, where she describes this condition of women as being deputy husbands, someone who can step in her husband's absence and make decisions, and really carry on very much as a man would do. And in this popular text, I snapped a portion of it. That you should go and read this just because it's really fun. But I'll read an excerpt for you, which says, "So much acquainted with his trade and so much a mistress of managing part of it, that she must be able to carry it on if she pleased." And it's really encouraging women, which seems very unlike the period at the time, but this author is encouraging women to get involved in your husband's businesses, because if he passes, you have to know where to find the money that is owed to him, and also to get his workers back to work. So it's really interesting that this is very much what was happening in the lives of people like Ruth and Elizabeth Fox and Grace Cole Searle Dennis. They were really just jumping in, as Defoe encourages, and saving the day. They're creating these lineages. So back to one of my favorite characters. So Hannah Fairweather Winthrop, who provides me with endless amounts of inspiration on this topic. It really shows how women not only jumped in terms of the operational sense, but also directed and promoted furniture forms. So when you look at this painting, there's been many, many, many scholars that just ogle over the style of painting that Copley has used here. She is very lifelike. She's got all of her wrinkles, and her costume is very realistic of the time period. But what I really love most about her is that shining mahogany table up in the front, and of course the chair that she's sitting in the back, because it really complements this woman who was incredibly influential in her time, that many of you know that she spent a little time in Concord. She literally witnessed the start of the American Revolution here. In those years, she was here from 1775 to 1776. And I love this part that Harvard College removed to Concord, during those years, during the siege of Boston. And she, of course, would have removed with her husband, who was a professor at Harvard, to Concord, spent time here, and probably brought a number of her favorite furnishings or personal items with her. So did she bring one of those tables with her? What did she bring? Did she bring a work table? We don't necessarily know to that degree, but we do know that she, in her inventory, at her estate inventory at her death, she owned not just one table. She owned many, 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 many types. And not just one type of tea table. She owned things like a mahogany round table, a mahogany tea board, a scalloped table, a plain table, and an extraordinary number of other furnishings that would have gone along with this, namely chairs, sofas, dining tables, and other accoutrement like silver and ceramics. In addition to that, too, she also had her collection, her library of books, and even her husband's microscope, which she easily could have given off to family members, children, or sold off many years before that, but remained close with it and obviously kept it in her possession. So it shows that she was a woman who was obviously surrounded by many objects and obviously ones that would be befitting of a woman of her status, but also may have suggested her personality as well, that you can see here, she's sitting at the table and where her posture could be politely seated with her hands folded in her lap. Instead, she's got her elbows up on that table. She's playing with a nectarine, which shows her knowledge of both natural history, botany, on the same level as her husband, who is renowned for his scientific teaching and interest in the natural world. So it's showing that level of, I'm as good as he is, and this is where I stand. And in addition to that, too, you can see that in the table there's this reflective surface, which is showing that the only thing that could really parallel her is her own reflection. She is a woman of a single kind. So it really just shows her power, her intellect, and in addition, my favorite thing about her is that she makes eye contact, that she does not avert her eyes, she's not demure, she's not cute, she is absolutely frightening. She is just looking right at you. So there's so many elements to this particular piece and what the furniture confirms about her personality. And it's interesting too that the furniture that was in her household and some of it that may have been here too really does act like she was as witness to what she saw. And one of the best things that Hannah Winthrop is known for is this wonderful triangle of letters between Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams. And it's almost this, you couldn't get better in terms of revolutionary document. These women sharing what they've heard from their husbands, their own emotional, feelings at the time. And in addition to that, literally what's happening minute by minute in that particular period. And it's just so fantastic that I think of her, leaning up against some of these furnishings and writing things to her two friends. And there's a great letter between Hannah Winthrop to Mercy Warren on August 17th, 1775. And they address each other in these very, fond ways. And she addresses Mercy as the friend and sister of my heart. And this excerpt from the letter reads, "I am charmed with the portrait you gave of General Washington. Must not we expect success on the direction of so much goodness? But my heart bleeds for the people of Boston. My blood boils with the resentment of the treatment they have met with from Gage. Can anything equal his barbarity?" And it's just really interesting to think about these furnishings also as witness as she is experiencing all of this. And I think about that too, that she's just a woman who truly was extraordinary. And I'm very fortunate to walk by her portrait every day. So it's interesting because Hannah Winthrop, as I mentioned, her inventory enumerated lots of different rooms filled with these extraordinary furnishings, and ones that had a lot of function in them, but also they communicated a certain persona and obviously communicated something about herself. And increasingly as wealth grows in the 18th and 19th centuries with the transatlantic trade, and also as interiors become much more elaborate. And there's many more consumable goods out there for people to spend their money on. Women are really at the center of this growth within the domestic setting, and the interiors start to reflect much more of their endeavors, and also just in those changing roles of women, as well as just the more public role that women are starting to serve. So this is a fantastic watercolor illustration by Johann Ender. And again, I'll translate the German, but it's a woman at her writing desk. So it's a lovely little scene. And obviously this is a little bit later than what we just saw with Mrs. Winthrop, but it shows the same sort of element of a woman surrounded by these furnishings that are really the tools of their daily lives. And at the center of that are these desks or work tables made for women and their work. So what was that work? And when you look at this neoclassical interior, you can really see how at the post-war period, what's really happening with women and the various elements of their education and their jobs in the household, of what's coming to them. So at her desk, she obviously has lots of writing implements and things for correspondence. In addition to that, you can see in the background, she's got bookshelves, probably filled with classics, even would have had, language studies, so there may be, a book on French or German, you name it. In addition to that, you can see she's got collections of art, both paintings and sculpture. And she too would have been an artist as well. She would have been encouraged to engage in either painting herself, drawing, needlework. This is all part of a classic education for a woman of this standing. In addition to that, you can see that, of course, the furniture makers are tapping into that sense of what would accompany a woman's life, what kind of furniture would befit these types of ladies who are very active and intelligent, and obviously just aspiring people. And so the Met has this fantastic broadside from Joseph Meeks and Sons, a New York manufacturer, and dating to roughly about the period of 1833. But you can see here on the left all sorts of types of furnishings that again are accompanying that new role and that new lifestyle that women are having in this post-war period. So you can see there's washstands, obviously because women are being expected to be out in public much more, so they have a different hygiene routine and cosmetic, regimen. In addition to that, there's a number of different types of wardrobes in this broadside. So again, you're out a lot, you got a couple of different costume changes in the course of the day, or depending on the type of event you're going to. In addition to that, there's other things like dining tables. So again, as you're hosting people in your home, and of course, one of the quintessential forms, which is a work table. So work table, a place for all of those different tools and elements of your lifestyle. And if you look over on the right-hand side, there's a number of different books that give sort of standard prices of what consumers should pay for certain types of furnishings. So in this particular book that was written about 1811, you can see on the right-hand side for work tables and writing tables, there's roughly 10 to 15 different types offered in this particular publication, and showing the different elements and price points that one could acquire a work table or writing table. So it just shows how commercialization has hit these forms intended for females, and how they really do complement the functions and specifications of their lifestyles. So one of the greatest work tables that I've ever seen, and obviously is standing glorious in your galleries upstairs, is this work table that belonged to Henry Thoreau's mother. And it is just a force. I mean, it is very squat and just volumetrically, it's much larger than the average work table of the time. And it's beautifully crafted that it's done in this style that's often called Grecian plain style. So it's where there's less carved element and there's more veneering and these sort of theatrical, wonderful, pieces of mahogany that have been, applied in ways to really, optimize the grain pattern and sort of this flashy appeal to it. But when you look at it, it's got this wonderful case on the bottom that often, those are, drawers that pull out where you can put all sorts of needleworking tools. The upper case of it has 3 drawers. Often you're going to have writing implements or locks for special, types of documents, so letters you don't want people to see. And then, of course, the extended work table, those 2 fly leaves that come up to give it a much larger, broader work surface. And as far as I understand from David, that this is the place where they may have been doing some of their needleworking on some of the quilts that came into Concord's collection. So these are the types of pieces, while you see them ubiquitously and people are always like, oh, it's a lady's work table, this is no dilettante piece. This is the command center of any home. And just think of that. Every bit of activity in a woman's life at that time would have been conducted largely from works like this, pieces of furniture like this. And so I say that not jokingly, like this is truly like the command center, because these are pieces that you can see with this one, it's got casters on it, and oftentimes they are mobile. So it's a frightening thought, especially for the more adolescent girls in the house, because mom would have taken her work table and plopped it down in whatever room she wanted to oversee that day. So she could have come down with this piece and put it into the main parlor. She could have looked out the front door to see who was coming to visit her husband. She could have kept an eye on all of her girls and made sure that they were doing something useful. She could have kept an eye on servants. These pieces were not only the command center, but also a place where she could have surveyed. Because of its mobility, she could have seen everything that was happening in her household while staying busy. So it's really interesting to think about that, the elements of her education, the artistic endeavors that she would have done, the delegation of work, and that mobility and that sense of surveillance that is in just one object. There's no other furnishing form where you can see that many layers to a woman's life than you can see in a work table. So it's really, truly one of my favorite pieces, and just thinking about that in terms of the Thoreau home, it truly embodies that all together. So the other fun part about it is there are other bits of popular culture and literature at the time that certainly reinforce that as well. And there's a wonderful book called the Ladies' Work Table Books. So a whole series of books just devoted to stuff you can do on the work table. And it's largely needlework and other types of small textile projects. But it's wonderful because you don't even get in the first few pages before the book reinforces, and I'll read this passage for you. Without her influence, life would be arrayed in sables, and the proud lords of creation would be infinitely more miserable and helpless than the beasts that perish. To render those terrestrial angels all that our fondest wishes could desire, or our most vivid imaginations picture, must be, under any circumstances, a pleasing and delightful employment, while for a father or brother to behold her returning all the care bestowed upon her by the thousands offices of love to the performance to which she alone is equal, is doubtless one of the most exalted sources of human felicity. It's like, enough said. It's like, put that up on your wall at home and see if anybody pays attention. So it's amazing to see that all of that comes together in this one form. But it's interesting, too, to see that as much as women were absolutely the epicenter of a lot of influence in the home, and especially amongst, furnishings like this, I am always contradicted by things all the time. And so even by Mrs. Thoreau's son, he obviously was surrounded by people in their house. And especially, I was talking with David and others about this, that I always wondered about Henry Thoreau in that he had so many women around him all the time. He had his 2 sisters, he had 5 aunts, plus his mom, who was very much an alpha. That must have just been overwhelming in itself. And also that he was obviously social, but in his own household and in terms of furnishings, and possibly as a result of maybe what he experienced in his own home, he had a wonderful quote about the way he thought of furnishings and possibly as a reaction to his mother's household. So, and I'll read this very quickly, but Henry Thoreau says, this is a chapter on visitors, that he says, "I had 3 chairs in my house, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, and 3 for society. And when visitors came in larger and unexpected numbers, there was but the 3rd chair for all of them, but they generally economized the room by standing up. It was surprising how many great men and women a small house will contain. I have had 25 or 30 souls with their bodies at once under my roof, and yet we often parted without being aware that we had come very near to one another." So I just think it's so interesting to see, again, women, your influence and how far it can go, and also the adverse reactions in some circumstances that it can take. But ultimately, I think there are so many connections between our collections, even in New York and in Massachusetts, and it's wonderful to see that that connection is truly women in our part, and obviously the lives of these objects, and to look at that. So take away tonight, take away that consideration of the operational support in those workshops, the sense of patronage and the direction and agency that those women patrons had, the market influence and the response of those commercial entities in providing something that women would have liked, and of course even the popular perceptions that people have as a result of women's influence. And I hope you will come back, that in you're having your celebration, will come back in 2024 to the American Wing and see how far we've come in terms of our interpretation of women. And I hope you'll visit us and just see the many parallels that we have between Concord and, of course, New York. Thank you. And I think we have time for questions, and I know that I have to just repeat the questions so folks online can hear the questions from the room. So are there any questions or comments? Or fact checks on Thoreau history, David? Chris?
I have a question. What was Mr. Cadwallader's wife's maiden name?
So
Elizabeth.
Lloyd, yes. So Elizabeth Lloyd Cadwallader, yes. And some of you may know her family plantation in Maryland is called Y. And so it was an enormous plantation and lands of which, kind of went into 2 different counties. So yeah, fantastic site. And the story with them, and I won't go too much into this because I know we're talking more about Massachusetts tonight, but her father was very sick at the time that she and her husband got married, and Elizabeth, being the dutiful daughter, went to Y to help nurse her father back to health and be by his side. And her father kept saying, "Go build a house, you're newlyweds, go build a house." And she kept putting it off. Eventually her husband enlisted his brother to help establish their house in Philadelphia and help to acquire all the furniture, commission all this furniture from a number of cabinet shops in Philadelphia. So they were slow to build this house, but she was certainly at the crux of it in terms of supplying that capital that produced one of the greatest Philadelphia townhouses of the time period. Yes.
You're just making me think about women's legal status at the time versus their actual functions in daily life. And it seems to me that there's been some sort of kind of dip and return over time. Would that be true? Because today we certainly are much stronger in terms of legal status. Still do all the
Yeah.
work, but there is this idea that women did nothing.
Yeah.
I'm not really articulating this very well, but...
Yeah, so the thought was that in the period, it appeared as women did very little, even though, and that their legal status was obviously much more dismal than it is now, and that today we obviously do more, and it seems like our legal status has improved, but maybe not. I think that's a question for everyone. I think that there's some major limitations and obviously some major changes in terms of our political system and legal status. And yeah, I think it's interesting that I know all of us during the pandemic had life-changing situations, but if you had people to care for during that time, how, your work and your family life and caring for others and trying to, do all that at once really came to a head for a lot of people, and they had to make those choices between work or family, and even just, not being able to do as much as we were. But yeah, I think it's a great open question. I don't know that I have the answer for it now in terms of, are we doing less now than we were then? I think we're all multitaskers and have a lot going on in our lives respectively.
It would have been true that there was no such thing as a non-contributing person in the household, right?
Well, I think, yeah, and that's where, again, it all depended too on status, because there's certain households where you may have more servants, and again, they could be immigrant servants, enslaved people. So I think households could be very different. In a household like Mrs. Winthrop or even Elizabeth Cadwallader, they obviously had many, many, many people helping them. So their functions and their role may have been more managerial, and they would have had different roles than in, say, a house that had, less economic stability and would have maybe been doing more of the day-to-day routine. So I think it definitely depended on your status. And it's the same today. It's like that too, that, it's me and my army of one at home, and we do all the work, and so I think it just depends on somewhat of economic status, and also regionally, that I think, obviously in that period, urban-wise versus rural, there may have been different roles that people played in those households as well. What a great thought. Yes?
I'm interested in the word, use of the word mobilia.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Is that meaning, well, what does it mean? Is it a technical term, or does it mean all the movable parts in a home?
So mobilia meaning furniture, but I was using it for alliteration too, just not to just say women's furniture. Yeah, and I think that there's, as we talked about too, there is that element of mobility. But I think in this case, the topic was furniture befitting of that matriarch or that person sort of at the helm of women's work, at the center of the household. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. Okay. Thanks.